All right, safety pros, welcome back. Today we are going to dive into something that you deal with every day on the job site. OSHA's 1926.1203 standard,
Oh, yeah.
specifically Subpart AA, which focuses on general requirements for confined spaces in construction.
Right.
This standard's all about preventing tragedies and keeping workers safe. So let's unpack what it means for you, and a big thanks to Safety One Source for making this deep dive possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a critical standard for anyone involved in construction safety. I mean, OSHA 1926.1203 sets the baseline for a robust confined space program, which, as you know, is absolutely essential in our line of work.
Exactly, and we've got a breakdown of the standard that highlights those need-to-know points and offers some practical insights.
Yeah.
I'm curious, what's the first thing that jumps out at you when you look at this standard?
For me, it's the emphasis on identifying those danger zones, right? The confined spaces themselves before any work boots hit the ground. OSHA requires a designated competent person to identify all potential confined spaces on a job site.
That makes sense. It's all about proactive risk assessment before someone unknowingly steps into a hazardous situation. But finding these spaces can't be as simple as just looking around, right? What makes someone competent to make those calls?
You hit the nail on the head. It's not just about recognizing a confined space, it's about understanding the nuances. A competent person has to evaluate each space, factoring in things like size, access points, potential hazards, and even conducting tests for hazardous atmospheres. Think of it like a detective searching for clues. They're looking beyond the obvious to uncover hidden risks.
So it's a much deeper analysis than simply pointing at a tank and saying, yep, that's a confined space. And once they've identified these danger zones, communication becomes key, right?
Right.
Big warning signs with skulls and crossbones, maybe.
Well, clear signage is crucial. And OSHA even suggests specific wording like, danger permit required, confined space, do not enter, to really drive the point home. But it goes way beyond just signs. Employers have a responsibility to inform everyone on site about these spaces, not just once, but regularly. Toolbox talks, safety bulletins, even site maps highlighting these areas. It's about making the information unavoidable.
Right, because construction sites are constantly changing and new hazards can pop up unexpectedly. We need to keep those dangers top of mind for everyone. What about communicating with other stakeholders like subcontractors or safety representatives? Is that addressed in the standard?
Absolutely. Clear and timely communication with authorized representatives and the controlling contractor is a must. Everyone involved needs to be on the same page to minimize risks. Imagine the chaos if a subcontractor started work in a confined space without the proper precautions because they weren't in the loop. Transparency and open communication are the cornerstones of a safe job site.
Okay, so we've identified the spaces and communicated the risks. What's next? How do we physically prevent someone from wandering into one of these hazards?
That's where access control comes into play. If an employer hasn't explicitly authorized someone to work in a specific confined space, they're obligated to take steps to prevent entry. Think physical barriers, locks, even designated work zones that clearly separate safe areas from no-go zones. It's not enough to just tell people to stay out. You have to actively make it difficult for them to enter.
So it's about creating those physical and visual cues that scream, stop, danger ahead. And I imagine this also ties into having a comprehensive written permit space program, right? Something that spells out all the procedures and responsibilities in black and white.
Your spot on OSHA 1926.1203 requires a written permit space program that meets the detailed requirements of Section 1926.1204. And this document needs to be accessible to everyone. It's a roadmap to safe entry and work practices, covering everything from initial hazard assessments to emergency rescue procedures. We can dig into the specifics of that program later, but remember, it's the backbone of any work involving confined spaces.
Now, I understand there are situations where a full permit isn't required. The standard offers an alternate procedure for entering a confined space. What are the conditions that allow for this alternate route?
You're referring to Section 1926.1203E, and it often causes some head-scratching. It's not a loophole, but a carefully controlled exception with very specific conditions. The key is eliminating or isolating all physical hazards within the space. Think moving parts, exposed wiring, sharp edges, anything that could cause direct physical harm. The only remaining hazard should be the atmosphere itself, and even then there are stringent requirements.
So even if you're taking this alternate route, you're still not off the hook when it comes to atmospheric hazards. No cutting corners there. What are some of the essential safety measures for this approach?
Continuous forced air ventilation is the foundation. Imagine powerful fans constantly circulating fresh air into the space, diluting and removing any hazardous gases or vapors. The standard lays out specific procedures for implementing this ventilation effectively. But it's not just about ventilation. We also need to Confirm that the air is actually safe.
Which means atmospheric monitoring, right? We're talking high-tech sensors and real-time data feeds.
Exactly. Continuous atmospheric monitoring is the gold standard. Think sensors and alarms, constantly tracking oxygen levels, flammable gases, and potential toxins, giving workers real-time information about air quality. If something goes wrong, they can evacuate immediately.
That sounds pretty sophisticated. But what if, for whatever reason, continuous monitoring isn't feasible? Does the standard offer any flexibility?
It does, but it's not a free pass. While continuous monitoring is preferred, OSHA allows for periodic monitoring in specific situations. Maybe the equipment isn't commercially available, or the nature of the space allows for frequent, reliable checks. But even with periodic monitoring, you need to follow strict guidelines for the frequency of checks and procedures for addressing any hazards.
So even this alternate route has a pretty rigorous checklist of safety measures. Can we break down exactly what employers need to address when using this procedure? What's the first thing on that list?
First and foremost, employers need to address the safety of removing any entrance covers. Think about a heavy manhole cover or a bolted hatch. If removing it could pose a risk, you need to mitigate that risk before proceeding. Once the cover is off, the opening needs to be immediately guarded to prevent accidental falls and protect workers inside from falling objects. It's not just about the space itself, it's about the entire process of accessing it.
Okay, so we're not just thinking about the space itself, but also the entry and exit points. What's next on this safety checklist?
Next up, atmospheric testing. Before anyone even thinks about entering the space, the atmosphere must be thoroughly tested using a calibrated direct reading instrument. And there's a specific order to follow: oxygen content first, then flammable gases and vapors, and finally any potential toxic contaminants. Importantly, both the employee entering the space and their authorized representative must be given the chance to observe this pre-entry testing.
So it's not just about testing, it's about transparency and verification every step of the way. Checks and balances to make sure we're not missing anything. We've covered entrance safety, atmospheric testing, and ongoing monitoring. What else is on this checklist?
Two crucial elements remain safe: entry and exit, and documentation. For entry and exit, the employer needs to ensure a safe method. If you're using a hoisting system, it has to be specifically designed and manufactured for personnel hoisting. And even if you're using a job-made hoisting system, it needs written approval for personnel hoisting from a registered professional engineer. No shortcuts here.
So the right equipment, properly vetted by a qualified professional. What about documentation? What are the key requirements there?
Documentation is crucial for proving that the space is safe and all pre-entry measures were taken. This involves a written certification that includes the date, the location, and the signature of the person verifying the space's safety. This certification must be completed before entry and made available to every employee entering, as well as their authorized representative. It's all about accountability and having a clear record of what's been done.
That makes sense. Now, what happens if a space that wasn't initially classified as a permit-required confined space undergoes changes that make it more hazardous? Does the standard address that?
It does. If a non-permit confined space undergoes changes in its use or configuration that increase potential hazards, or if there's any indication that the initial evaluation was inadequate, it needs a reevaluation by a competent person, and if necessary, it gets reclassified as a permit-required confined space.
So the classification isn't set in stone. It can change as the worksite changes.
Oh.
And on the flip side, if a permit-required space is modified to eliminate hazards, can it be reclassified as a non-permit space?
Absolutely, but there's a process for that outlined in Section 1926.1203G. A competent person needs to confirm that all the requirements for reclassification have been met, which means eliminating or isolating all the hazards. Then they need to document this determination with a written certification, making it available to all employees who might enter the space.
So reclassification in either direction requires that thorough assessment, proper documentation, and clear communication to everyone involved. It's all about making sure the classification accurately reflects the level of risk. Now, I imagine things can get a bit complicated when multiple employers are involved on a project. How does OSHA address communication and coordination in those multi-employer situations?
That's a crucial aspect, and OSHA provides clear guidelines in Section 1926.1203, outlining the specific responsibilities of the host employer, the controlling contractor, and any entry employers. It's all about ensuring that everyone has the information they need to work safely.
Okay, so let's break down that communication chain. Who's responsible for what?
Let's start with the host employer, the one who owns or controls the property where the work is being done. Their main job is to give the controlling contractor all the information they have about known permit spaces. This includes the location of each space, the hazards present, why it's classified as a permit space, and any precautions used in the past to protect workers. They're essentially setting the stage by providing a comprehensive overview of the site's confined spaces.
So the host employer provides the initial intel on confined spaces. What about the controlling contractor's role? What do they do with that information?
The controlling contractor is like the central hub for information and coordination before work begins. They gather all the information from the host employer about those permit space hazards and previous entry operations. Then they have to share this information with every entity entering a permit space, as well as any other entity whose activities could create a hazard in a permit space. They're also responsible for sharing any additional information they have about these spaces and the precautions that have been implemented in the past. They're ensuring everyone involved has the same level of awareness about the risks.
It sounds like a pretty crucial role in preventing miscommunication and potential accidents. Now, what about those entry employers, the ones actually sending their employees into these spaces? What are their responsibilities?
Entry employers have a critical role to play too before their team sets foot in a confined space. They need to get all the information from the controlling contractor regarding permit space hazards and entry operations. They also need to inform the controlling contractor about their specific permit space program, including any hazards they anticipate encountering or creating during their work. It's a two-way street, ensuring that everyone is aware of the specific procedures and precautions being taken by each team.
So it's a collaborative effort between the entry employer and the controlling contractor. What about coordination during the actual entry operations? How do they ensure everyone's on the same page and working safely together?
That's where coordination becomes paramount. The standard mandates coordination between the controlling contractor and entry employers whenever multiple entities are performing permit space entry at the same time, or when entry is happening concurrently with other activities that could create a hazard. This coordination is essential to prevent conflicts, ensure everyone's safety protocols are compatible, and prevent unforeseen hazards from cropping up.
It's all about teamwork and communication to ensure a safe work environment for everyone. Now, after the entry operation is finished, is there any follow-up communication required?
Absolutely. The controlling contractor needs to debrief each entity that entered a permit space. This debriefing should cover the permit space program they followed and any hazards encountered or created during entry. Likewise, each entry employer needs to inform the controlling contractor about the program they followed and any hazards they faced. And lastly, the controlling contractor must share all this information with the host employer.
So it's not just about communication before and during entry, but also after, ensuring that everyone learns from the experience and any issues are documented and shared. What happens if there's no controlling contractor on site? Does the standard address that scenario?
Yes, it does. If there's no controlling contractor, the host employer or another employer who arranges for permit space entry steps into those shoes, this ensures that even in less complex work structures, the same level of communication and coordination is maintained.
It sounds like OSHA has really thought through the different scenarios that might arise and provided clear guidelines for communication regardless of the employer structure.
Exactly. And this emphasis on communication is really at the heart of OSHA 1926.1203. It's about ensuring that everyone involved in a project, from the host employer down to the individual worker entering a confined space, has the information they need to make smart decisions and stay safe.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into OSHA 1926.1203, focusing on subpart AA. We talked about identifying those confined spaces, preventing unauthorized entry, and understanding those alternate procedures. We also dug into the communication and coordination requirements, highlighting the roles and responsibilities of all those involved.
It's a lot to digest, but it's really about breaking down this complex standard into manageable pieces and focusing on those core principles: proactive risk assessment, clear communication, and a relentless commitment to worker safety. Those are the foundations of a successful confined space safety program.
Okay, let's take a quick break and come back to discuss some of the specific challenges and best practices for going above and beyond basic compliance.
And as a reminder, this deep dive is presented by Safety One Source, your go-to resource for all things workplace safety.
Oh, yeah.
They offer a wealth of information and training resources to help you navigate the complexities of OSHA regulations, including 1926.1203.
They really are a fantastic resource, especially for safety professionals like us who are constantly striving to stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about going beyond basic compliance. We've discussed what OSHA requires, but as safety champions, shouldn't we always be aiming higher?
Absolutely. It's easy to fall into the trap of simply checking boxes and meeting the minimum requirements, but a truly effective safety culture goes beyond just compliance. It's about proactively seeking ways to improve and innovate to create a work environment where safety is woven into the fabric of every task.
I love that safety as part of the fabric, not just an afterthought. So where do we start? How do we move beyond just meeting those minimum requirements and create a truly world-class safety program?
Let's start by looking at how we identify and classify confined spaces. Are we relying solely on visual inspections, or are we embracing technology? Imagine using 3D scanning to create detailed maps of those spaces, uncovering potential hazards that might not be visible to the naked eye. We have incredible tools at our disposal these days, and we should be utilizing them to enhance safety.
That's a great point. Technology can be a game changer in safety. It's not about replacing human expertise, but about augmenting it, giving us that extra layer of insight. What about communication and training? How can we go beyond simply relaying the basic OSHA requirements?
Think about how we deliver that information instead of dry lectures or dense manuals. Let's get creative interactive simulations, virtual reality training, even gamified learning experiences. We need to engage our workers and make sure those safety messages stick.
I love that idea. It's about making safety training relevant, engaging, and even fun. People learn best when they're actively involved, not just passively listening. What about emergency response? How can we ensure we're not just prepared, but truly ready to respond effectively if an incident occurs?
It all comes down to practice. That emergency response plan shouldn't be gathering dust on a shelf. It needs to be a living document, something we regularly review, practice, and refine. Imagine conducting realistic drills that involve all the relevant teams and stakeholders, simulating different scenarios and identifying any weaknesses in our response.
Those are fantastic ideas. It's about moving beyond a reactive approach to safety and embracing a proactive preventative mindset.
Exactly, and that shift in mindset is what truly separates a good safety program from a great one. It's about constantly questioning, innovating, and striving for that next level of excellence.
It's inspiring to think about all the possibilities for improving safety. This deep dive into OSHA 1926.1203 has given me so many ideas to take back to my workplace, but I know our listeners are eager to hear your final thoughts and advice. What's the one key takeaway you want them to remember?
Remember, safety is not just a box to check. It's a continuous journey of learning improvement and unwavering commitment. Never settle for good enough when it comes to protecting our workers.
That's such a powerful message, and a huge thank you to Safety One Source for sponsoring this deep dive and empowering us to elevate safety standards in our workplaces. So to all our listeners out there, I challenge you to look at your own confined space safety programs with a critical eye. Where can you go above and beyond? What steps can you take to push the boundaries of safety and create a work environment where everyone feels protected and empowered?
It's all about fostering that culture of prevention. We need to move beyond simply reacting to incidents and focus on anticipating and mitigating risks before they even arise. That's how we create lasting change.
I couldn't agree more. It's about empowering every worker to be a safety champion, to feel comfortable speaking up if they see something that doesn't look right, and to actively contribute to creating a safer work environment.
And that starts with leadership. We need safety leaders who walk the walk, who are visible advocates for safety, and who empower their teams to prioritize safety every single day.
It's about leading by example and making it clear that safety is not negotiable. It's not an option. It's a core value that guides everything we do.
Exactly. And when we achieve that, when safety becomes ingrained in the DNA of an organization, that's when we truly see the transformative power of prevention. That's when we create a workplace where everyone can go home safely at the end of the day.
And that's what it's all about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into OSHA 1926.1203. We hope you've gained valuable insights and a renewed sense of purpose in your safety journey.
And a big thank you to Safety One Source for making this conversation possible. They're an incredible resource for staying informed, getting trained, and building a world-class safety program.
Until next time, stay safe out there and never stop striving for that next level of safety excellence.